In chapter 482, 7 of the Wandenreich messengers infiltrated the Gotei 13 Captain Commander's barracks to declare war on the Soul Society, easily killing Yamamoto's lieutenant, stealing his bankai, humiliating Yamamoto in the process, and then disappearing in the shadows to report to their leader, Mr. Aura himself, Yuhabach. Yuha's introduction in the Wandenreich, where he decimates one of his own men and follows it up with the "I dislike conflict" line, alongside the war declaration scene, the Quincy Emperor song, and the tiny pieces of backstory that we got the more we progress into the arc, set the bar high for him and his army, differentiating them from the previous villain groups, and also hinted to so much deep lore behind his origins and existence that was intrinsically connected to the world of Bleach itself, making him feel rather interesting and intriguing to say the least. However, unfortunately, the more we approached the end of Thousand Year Blood War arc, it felt like everything that had been built up around Yuha started to fall apart, which led many to look down on and question the writing, not just of Yuha as a villain, but of Thousand Year Blood War arc as a whole. And when you combine this with the active slander Bleach used to get back in the day, it is no surprise that Yuha is often misinterpreted and reduced to just another overpowered shallow villain. But that couldn't be further from the truth. There is so much more to his character as the final villain of the story, themes he embodies, and the lore tied to his very existence than what the Rush manga ending ever had chance to properly explore. And that's exactly why I'm making this video, to defend my glorious Quincy King, Yuhabach. So sit back, gentlemen, and let me piece together everything we have been given about Yuha to clear his name from any slander he receives and truly understand how crucial he is to the story of Bleach. What makes Yuha a great and memorable final villain is that he genuinely is terrifying. He establishes a constant sense of threat that carries an apocalyptic presence that sets him apart from the rest of Bleach's villain cast. As unfortunately, in my opinion, one of Kubo's biggest mistakes with earlier villains was how their initial threat level often faded over time. They were introduced properly, but that tension didn't always last. And even though some of them, like Yhwach or Eisen, just to name a few, broke that cycle and pushed Ichigo to his limits, heck, one of them stopped his theme song with one finger, and the other literally killed him. None of them was nearly as threatening or menacing as Yuha. Yuha was the only villain who truly instilled despair into Ichigo's soul, made him give up, and was the only one to go undefeated in a 1v1 battle until the end of the series. And by the way, don't get it twisted, I'm not saying Yuha is a better villain overall than Eisen or Yhwach. What I'm saying is that Yuha was the only villain who maintained and even became a much dangerous threat over the course of his screen time, while constantly making it feel like he was actually about to wipe out everything with absolutely no one able to stop him. On the other hand, Yhwach, for example, tried to instill despair into Ichigo's soul to prove that the courage he drew from his heart could be shattered in the face of overwhelming power. But ultimately, Yhwach failed. This stands in contrast to Yuha, who did manage to break Ichigo's spirit at one point, a parallel I'll touch on more later in a minute. Also, from the viewer's perspective, yeah, Yhwach technically killed Ichigo, but Ichigo wasn't even close to being the strongest at that point. So had Ichigo not been revived, Yhwach wouldn't have stood a chance against the Gotei 13, let alone someone like Yamamoto who could have easily soloed the Espada alongside Gin and Tosin at the same time. And as for Eisen, he soloed the Gotei 13, sure, but even if he had defeated Ichigo, there was still another line of defense, which is the Zero Division, and even though Eisen would have stomped them, narratively, he still had a few more obstacles standing between him and his end goal. Now look at Yuha. From the moment he was introduced, he went on a generational run that is arguably better than Eisen's. Like, Kubo introduced Bro killing his own men. And the first time we see him in action, he no-defs Zaraki. What is even crazier, this wasn't even him. This was a clone that has only 80% of his base powers. And in base, he sees Yamamoto's bankai and chops him in half. He tries to recruit Eisen, and imagine if they teamed up. Well, had they teamed up, Yamamoto would have died from a heart attack before Yuha dealt the finishing blow. He then bitch slaps enraged Ichigo like he's nothing, pulverizes Ichibi even after erasing him from existence, bitch slaps Ichigo again after getting his truths on Pacto, forces him to kill the Soul King, his father and the keystone that holds the universe together, and then absorbs him. And in the final battle, he breaks Ichigo's spirit, takes down Eisen despite falling under his hypnosis, and despite losing eventually. If it wasn't for the Rush manga ending, this would have gone down as one of the greatest villain gauntlets in anime history. What I'm trying to say is, the story of Bleach needed a villain like Yuha, someone who not only challenges and poses a threat to the good guys in terms of power, and was so close to destroying the very world that a significant chunk of the story revolves around, but also complements and deeply ties into both the lore and the story on a thematic level. Bleach has always explored themes like overcoming fate, life and death, the heart, courage, and much more, but it wasn't until Yuha's conclusion that many of the core ideas and gaps in the lore were brought full circle. For instance, early in the series we are introduced to the different realms and races that make up the world of Bleach, the cycle of souls, and how the Soul Reapers maintain that balance. And as early as chapter 11, Kubo drops the first hint at one of the story's core ideas, as well as the early setup for Yuha's character and the conflict between the Quincy and Shinigami, when we learn about the Quincy extermination carried out by the Soul Reapers due to the Quincy disrupting the circulation of souls by killing Hollows. a concept that wouldn't be fully explored until the Thousand-Year Blood War arc. And in chapter 63, we are introduced to Old Man Zangetsu, the enigmatic side of Ichigo, and a mysterious figure who appears to be the source of his power. At the time, there was no direct hint or obvious connection between Old Man Zangetsu and Yuha or the Quincy in general, but as it was revealed later, Ichigo's journey and quite literally his whole life and identity has a lot more to do with Yuha and the Quincy's than you might think. The connection between Ichigo and Yuha began 7 years before the story even started, on the day Ichigo's mother was killed. At the time, neither we nor Ichigo had any idea that Yuha was involved. But that single event changed both the course of the story as well as Ichigo's life forever. From that day on, he was no longer the person he used to be. Guilt and self-blame shaped the rest of Ichigo's life, driving his desire to protect those he cares about. It is that need to protect that made him crave power, a power that Rukia ultimately gave him. But in order to truly protect others, Ichigo had to fight. He had to grow stronger to keep up with the rising threats, and that meant discovering his true nature of his own powers. And that's when he discovered Old Man Zangetsu, the only inheritance left to him by his mother, which explains why he hid the truth about his real identity, yet never once failed to aid Ichigo in battle. In a way, he was protecting Ichigo all along from a threat Ichigo never knew existed. Nevertheless, Ichigo continued fighting for what he believed, and that path led him into countless battles where both his life and his ideals were put to the test, and his battle against Ulquiorra is the prime example. Both Ulquiorra and Yuha embodied despair but in fundamentally different ways. Ulquiorra couldn't comprehend concepts like the heart or the courage drawn from that heart because he couldn't see them. To him, if something couldn't be touched or reflected in his eyes, it simply didn't exist, so he sought to destroy those ideals. Yet at the end, he failed, because the heart, that unseen intangible thing, is exactly what allows someone to endure despair. On the other hand, Yuha using the Almighty saw everything, every future, every heart, every possibility, and bent them all to his will. In his eyes, there was no meaning in heart, courage, or the choices people make. No matter what anyone did, the future would all slip through their fingers like grains of sand shifting from one outcome to another, all under his control. So when faced with an enemy like that, someone who set out to strip the world of meaning and reshape reality into a still lifeless eternity, where even death no longer exists, and consequently life would lose meaning, the only logical response is to give up, even if only for a moment as Ichigo did. Now compare that to what Ichigo faced against Eisen. While Eisen was undeniably a formidable villain who challenged Ichigo's resolve multiple times, especially after revealing he planned Ichigo's whole life, he ultimately wasn't the all-controlling mastermind we thought he was. As revealed in everything but the Rain flashback during the Thousand-Year Blood War arc, Eisen didn't orchestrate every event, and instead sometimes he took advantage of coincidences and integrated them in his bigger plan. And this is one of the key contrasts between Yuha and Eisen. On the surface, they seem to share the same goal, to destroy the Soul Society and anything they stood for, to tear down the world as it is and reshape it into something of their own. But the paths they walked couldn't have been more different. Eisen had to plan and calculate every move to reach his goal. His rise was something he forced into existence. Yuha, on the other hand, is a divine figure who didn't need to do anything. He simply had to wait for the prophecy to unfold, for his power to return, and then take everything. He didn't rise to power. He was destined to reclaim it exactly as he had foreseen. That said, the most important difference between the two lies in their view of the world, especially when it comes to the concept of life and death. But before we get into that, I need to clarify a shit ton of context first. Life and death is one of Bleach's overarching core themes. This concept is reflected throughout the story and emphasized in the volume poems. Ichigo's first volume poem states, "We fear what we cannot see." This line refers to death, formless, invisible, and therefore incomprehensible to the human eye. Because we cannot perceive it, we fear it. In the first arc, Ichigo stood apart from the others in his ability to see spirits. He understood the sorrow of souls who can no longer interact with the world of living, forced to watch life go on without them. This perspective evokes empathy for hollows. Spirits turned into mindless monsters by grief and regret over something beyond their control. Meanwhile, Rukia's Volume 2 poem reads, "People have hope because they don't see death standing behind them." Her message is that the very reason that makes us fear death is also what gives us hope, as we try to push this truth out of our minds so it doesn't take away our will to live. White's Volume 25 poem delves into the philosophical importance of death, at least within the world of Bleach. He states, "We're all born dead. The end exists before anything begins. If living is a constant quest for awareness, the awareness we gain at the end is the real goal. In other words, death is the discovery and complete understanding of the end. We're not permitted to seek awareness. Those that cannot transcend death will not find awareness in anything." According to White's poem, death is guaranteed for all of us, and it's also what brings meaning to our lives. However, it's our choice to seek this awareness and meaning. If we're constantly straying away from death, then we won't find any meaning in life. Those who cannot accept the end will never find understanding. And this was one of the many reasons why Eisen refused to work with Yuha. During Eisen's time in the Muken, he reflected on a lot of his past insecurities and struggles. In Eisen's pursuit of transcendence, he became an immortal being who lost all senses of living. And that's why he ultimately saw Yuha's ideal world as flawed. A world without fear of death, in Eisen's eyes, is a world without hope, because it is through confronting fear and persevering despite it that people find purpose and the strength to move forward. Eisen's speech about the courage ties deeply with the previous poems as well as the final volume poem that fittingly has both Ichigo and Rukia on its cover. Volume 74 poem reads, "Even without a form, we'll never stop walking. Essentially, even with death awaiting us, we can still move forward in life while fending off this fear due to a unique trait we have, and it's called courage." Through these poems and unique dialogue that ironically came from an immortal, we see the often contradictory ways mortals perceive death, as both a source of fear and suffering, as well as a silent motivator, something that pushes them to confront their grief, continue living, and seek meaning in life. Yuha, on the other hand, wanted to erase the very concept of death from the world. While his motivations remain somewhat unclear at this point, if I had to speculate, I believe it is because of 1. Yuha's unique nature where he lives off the deaths of his own people, a process that, while vital to his survival, brings him suffering. In the anime-only flashback from episode 24 in the Thousand Year Blood War arc, Yuha mentions that he hears the anguished cries of the souls that return to him. He implies that this pain is one of the reasons he wishes to erase the concept of death entirely. But this wasn't the only reason. Yuha's hatred runs deeper. He despises the Soul Reapers for betraying his father and creating a world where his survival depended on the suffering of others. At the same time, he resents the Soul King, his own father, for betraying him, as implied multiple times in anime original scenes throughout the third core. This layered resentment was what drove Yuha to destroy everything they stood for, even if it meant eliminating the very structure that allowed him to survive outside the liminal state he was stuck in when he was born. Even though Yuha may appear to be the ultimate ruthless villain seeking to erase the world, he is in some ways also a victim of the system. His unique existence and the life and death cycle enforced by the Soul Reapers may have offered hope to the mortals, but it brought nothing but suffering to the Quincy and to Yuha himself since childhood. That's why he never hesitated to kill Soul Reapers. He viewed them as upholders of a system that causes pain to everyone. Yet interestingly, even though Ichigo is the Soul Society's greatest ally, Yuha didn't initially see Ichigo as an enemy. In fact, he repeatedly questioned Ichigo's reasons for fighting, almost as if he wanted him to understand his perspective. However, in the end, thanks to the combined efforts of Eisen, Ichigo, and his allies, Yuha was defeated and failed to achieve his goals. And ironically, he ended up in the same state as his father, a being eternally bound to the cycle he tried so desperately to erase, a fate he once described as endless humiliation. On the other hand, Ichigo, whose life was shaped and scarred by the concept of death, ultimately rejected Yuha's so-called utopia, recognizing it for what it truly was, a state of stagnation, and instead, he chose to move forward. He embraced life and even had a child called Kazoi, or however the hell it's pronounced, a name that translates to courage.